Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player. All right. Today, my guest is Noah Tetzner. He is the creator and host of the History of Vikings podcast. Hi, Noah.
Hey, Stephanie. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, I'm really excited. So on this show so far, we have covered Viking history, but only Vikings in Iceland. And, well, actually, let me back up. That's not exactly true. So we've covered Vikings in Iceland with Thingvellir, and Leah Commando came on the show for that. And then we covered the Viking raids at Lindisfarne and covered English history at Lindisfarne from a English perspective, but that was still Viking history too. But one area that, and I'm excited to talk about it with you, that I don't know if Americans, Canadians really think about when we think about Vikings is what happened in Denmark. Because obviously, I think Americans, we tend to think of the Vikings were in Norway and Sweden, then they went to Iceland, then they destroyed England. But I don't know if we really connect it all with their entire realm. So we're going to talk about the history of Vikings in Denmark today and a little town that I really enjoyed visiting called Roskilde. So thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So
Noah, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in Vikings and your background?
Yeah, so obviously I run a podcast called The History of Vikings, and myself being a younger gentleman, ever since I was a really little kid, I've always just loved history. I've been a history buff, and I consider myself somewhat of an amateur historian, but the Vikings really piqued my interest when I started reading the Norse myths. That is the religion of the Vikings, Norse mythology. You know, when I discovered the tales of Thor, Odin, and Loki, and Ragnarok, and how what really got me interested is, these characters are all so prevalent in modern culture thanks to the Thor movies and Marvel movies and the Marvel comics. But when you actually read the Norse myths, Thor and Loki and Odin are nothing like they're portrayed in the Marvel movies. So thanks to Norse mythology, that really got me into the Vikings. And, of course, you learn about the enduring image of the Vikings as these bloodthirsty warriors and raiders. And naturally, that piqued my interest. But then as I continued to learn about them, I learned that they were much more of a simple people and much more agricultural, but nonetheless super interesting. So I just love the Vikings, and that's why I'm so excited to talk about them with you today.
So let's talk about what Scandinavia looks like and who are the Vikings that are in Denmark. Are they different than the Vikings that were in Sweden or Norway? Why are they spread out so far?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And I think that since Scandinavia is obviously, as you mentioned, the homeland of the Vikings, that is, the countries of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark are very much the original countries of the Vikings. We know the Vikings eventually went off to Iceland and Greenland and England and raided France a little bit, but Scandinavia is very much their original homeland. So as far as the difference between the different kinds of Vikings, whether they be the Vikings from Norway, Vikings from Denmark, Vikings from Sweden, I think they're all very much similar culturally, if you will. They all went raiding and they all had very much the same sort of lifestyles and the same cultures, and they all worshiped the same gods. But I think the main differences between the Vikings from those three Scandinavian countries is what they did. So the Vikings in Sweden enjoyed a lifestyle of exploration. They were the ones going down the Volga River and traveling down the rivers of Russia and eventually besieging Constantinople, which of course was the greatest, wealthiest, largest city in the world at the time. The Vikings in Norway were the ones responsible for colonizing Greenland and Iceland, as well as eventually discovering North America and Newfoundland. But the Vikings in Denmark perhaps left the biggest footprint on history, if you will, in that they were the ones responsible for going on all of the famous monastery raids across England. They were the ones who actually founded, or not founded, but they were the ones who really transformed the city of York in northern England into a sort of trading empire. They were the ones who really sort of built up England, and especially the town of York in northern England. So I think that those are the main characteristics between the main differences between the different Vikings, is just sort of where they traveled and what they did.
So the Vikings in Denmark, let's go through the history of the Vikings there. What does it look like at the beginning? And then what does it look like once they're really settled there?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the history of Denmark as a nation, as we know it, really doesn't begin until the Vikings and until the Viking Age. Before the Viking Age, around the years 700 and 800, we really don't know anything about the country that is now Denmark. So the history of Denmark really emerges with the Vikings. Naturally, the Vikings have always lived in Denmark, along with rest of Scandinavia. The reason why we don't know very much about the Danish people before the Viking Age is because the Greeks and the ancient Romans didn't really bother to send any explorers that far north. The Danish people before the Viking Age would have been considered barbarians, which means that the Romans and the Greeks, the big cultural powerhouses at the time, really despised them. They didn't like barbarians very much. So naturally, they weren't studied or written about. And of course, the people of Denmark were largely illiterate, and they, didn't really keep any written documents. So we don't really know much about the, prehistory of Denmark or Denmark before the Viking Age, but we do know about the country that is Denmark when they really started to come into their own, and the Vikings really started to go off raiding. And who are these people from Denmark? Who are these ferocious Norsemen? That's really where the history of Denmark as a nation began. Is the Viking Age.
So once they are firmly established in Denmark, what does it look like? Who's in charge of them? What's life like there?
Yeah, so Viking life in Denmark is very much one of agriculture. That's one thing that most people fail to realize about the Vikings. As I said earlier, there's this enduring image of the Vikings as fearless raiders and bloodthirsty warriors, which indeed they were, and they certainly wouldn't hesitate to go off raiding and enslaving monks and pillaging monasteries. But they lived a very agricultural lifestyle. So there would have been various Viking settlements made up of farmsteads throughout Denmark. And in fact, we found quite a few archaeological discoveries of their various farmsteads in Denmark. So yeah, life in Viking Denmark would have been one very simple. These Vikings lived on small farms, and they raised livestock, and were obsessed with maintaining family honor, and they lived these very simple lifestyles. And as far as the leadership of Viking Denmark, that would have been, in each settlement, they would have been ruled by a sort of Viking chieftain. But eventually, and I'm sure we'll talk about this once we get into the history of Roskilde, there's a series of Danish Viking kings. So those were the people who ruled Denmark once we started knowing about the Vikings and knowing about the people who actually lived there.
So what are some of the earliest recorded historic events that we know about?
I would say, as far as like Denmark itself, I don't know if there's anything too significant going on there, other than we know that Vikings were living on farms and worshiping gods and writing rune stones and creating little monuments and, various houses. But we really start to know about the Vikings in Denmark when they started raiding England. In 793, the Danish Vikings, I believe it was, the Danish Vikings raided the famous monastery of Lindisfarne in England, and that was just a huge shock to the monks living there, but just the people of Europe as a whole, because that they were just shocked that these bearded men wielding spears and axes with painted shields, sailing up in these massive longships, with carved dragon heads. They had never seen anyone quite like them. So that was a big shock to the people of Europe. And that is indeed where we really start to first know about the Vikings in Denmark.
So if anybody watches the History Channel's version of the TV show Vikings, which I'm obsessed with, Kattegat is in Denmark. So that's the type of people, even though it wasn't those specific Vikings, those are, historic compilations of people from the sagas. Like, even though it's not those specific people, that's the type of lifestyle. If you remember what Ragnar's life was like towards the beginning of that show, when he's just like a very simple farmer, that's kind of what these people's life would have been like, correct?
Yeah, totally. I think that's a great. Yeah, I think that's an accurate description.
All right. So Denmark becomes very powerful, and it becomes a huge power, but it's a Viking power, but it takes on a little bit more of a nation state situation with they have kings that are, partially sometimes in control of England. How do they go from raiders to really having their own nation?
Yeah, so the Viking Age is a period that lasted for 300 years approximately, and now I won't get all technical with the dates, but approximately the year 793 to about 1066, and that's when William the Conqueror came to England, of course. But I think that they sort of transitioned into the monarchy and kingships, and they really started becoming a legitimate nation, if you will. And the person who founded that, who I'm about to mention, King Harold Bluetooth, is actually directly related to the history of Roskilde, so that should be interesting. But it really begins with the reign of a man by the name of King Harold Bluetooth. Now, King Harold Bluetooth was the second king of Denmark, and he is very much the one responsible for bringing Christianity to Denmark. And that's a big deal, because Christianity was the major cultural system of every other major European power. The Frankish Empire, the Anglo-Saxons, they were all Christians. So by making Christianity the state religion in Denmark, he really ensured that, number one, other kings wouldn't attack Denmark. And it really showed that Denmark was becoming a modern nation. I believe it's on the first page. If you look at a Danish passport, there's a picture of a drawing that's on this stone made by King Harold Bluetooth, known as the Yelling Stone. And that was a monument on this giant rock that he inscripted, that he commissioned to be built. And it's a picture of Jesus being all snangled up in these sort of like, I don't know what you'd call them, like weeds or roots or something like that. And he's sort of breaking free from them. And that's to show that he's breaking free. Christianity is coming out of their old pagan ways. And it is interesting to note that paganism, and what I mean by paganism is the practice of worshiping the old Norse gods, Thor, Odin, Loki, that was very much still practiced even after Christianity was made the national religion. For the beginning of his reign, King Harold Bluetooth, I guess you could say really the one of the first major legitimate kings of Denmark, still practiced paganism. But it was only after there was pressure and influence coming from other European powers to make Christianity the national religion that he, was baptized. So the emergence of Denmark as a major nation and a legitimate country really starts with the spread of Christianity, I would say.
So how does Christianity change the Vikings? I think, and I don't think it counts as spoilers when you're talking about a show that deals with history, but you definitely see the tension in these Danish people as different elements become more Christian, and there's a lot of back and forth between the two sides. So how would that really have affected people's lives? How did it affect government?
So I think, let me just start at before we get into sort of the politics of it, let me just start with the average Viking man or woman. So it's interesting because the Vikings, who were, a pagan people for hundreds of years, they had prayed to Thor and Odin, and they had prayed to different gods for different reasons. If they were going out to sea, they might pray to the sea god Njord to grant them safe passage on their voyages. If they were when they were on the farm and they were doing agricultural work and maintaining a farmstead, they would pray to Thor, as he was very much the average man's god. And the rich people would pray to Odin, who is the god of sort of wisdom and poetry, as well as war. And, because those rich people, they would be in pursuing wisdom and victory in war. But when Christianity came in, I don't think that the populace I don't think the populace really enjoyed having to worship the Christian God. Of course, that is Jesus, because at the time, Christianity was really seen as a religion in where God was judging people. You know what I mean? So they really saw the Christian God as a judge who was sitting on his high seat in heaven, looking down upon them. So there was really sort of this, the people were very reluctant to convert to Christianity, and I would say, and while Christianity was sort of a social club at the time, King Harold Bluetooth and all of the nobility would have converted right away. But I was actually talking to an expert in sort of Christianity and Norse mythology and the paganism, and she told me that, the major population wouldn't have been so quick to give up their old pagan ways.
Oh, interesting. So what are some important events in Danish history that happened during the Viking Age?
It's interesting because towards the beginning of the Viking Age, as I mentioned earlier, the Danes migrating to England and establishing the city of York in northern England. Although that's not an event that took place in Denmark, it is one largely influenced by solely Danish people. So they founded the city of Jorvik. They didn't found the city of Jorvik. They took over the city of Jorvik, which is, of course, modern-day York, in around 865 and 866, and they turned that into a huge trading city. So that's an important event. I would say that later in the Viking Age, the spread of Christianity was a big deal. King Harold Bluetooth was the first. He was only the second king of Denmark, but was the first to be baptized, and he influenced the country in a way where Christianity became the foremost social club slash religion slash just group that everyone was a part of. It's sort of what you did, and it's interesting to note. And I just do make a big point of Christianity in Denmark because, of course, for hundreds of years after that, Christian kings ruled Denmark, and their religion of Christianity very much influenced the way that they ruled. So I would say those were the main events of the Danish history. The up until the Viking Age, of course, the Danes traveling to England, migrating, founding cities, conquering the land, sending great armies over in fleets of long ships. There's a lot of places that have sort of Scandinavian and especially Danish influence and roots in England. So I would say that that's the main legacy of the Vikings in Denmark.
Now let's talk specifically about Roskilde. And for listeners, I just want to introduce this town a little bit. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, or there is a UNESCO World Heritage Site there, but it's actually a later cathedral. It's where all of the Danish kings from modern royalty are buried, except for one, I believe, are buried there. But the town also has a Viking ship museum. And a lot of people, I think, are familiar with the fact that there's a really great Viking museum in Norway. I haven't gotten a chance to go yet. But this one in Denmark is one of the coolest things I've ever done in my travels. And I've obviously, I've done a lot of cool things I've had a lot of really fun days. But this Viking museum is just insanely cool. And what it is there used to be a Viking settlement, and you and I are going to talk about the history of it there. And there is a fjord there. And in the fjord, they found five ships. And so they actually built a museum there, and then they have reproduced these ships. So when you go to Roskilde, you can not only can you see like the remains of these cool Viking ships, but you can also sail in them, which is like
wow,
so cool. So like, you know, like you buy your ticket, and it's not like super cheap, but it's not the most expensive thing you do in Denmark. Denmark is an expensive place to travel. So if you're going to Denmark anyway, you're going to spend a little bit of money. But you get in the ship, and they don't steer it for you, because I think people know that like Viking ships are just full of rowers. Like that's most of what's in there is cargo and rowers. And so somebody from the museum will be in the ship, and they'll teach your group how to sail. And so you sail up and down the fjord, and they have like other things too, where you can do like longer days or special things or different, like you can do more customized things. But the general thing that you just do if you just show up is sail up and down the fjord once. And then the thing that I appreciated the most was that there are other ships in the fjord too, because they take multiple groups out. So not only are you sailing like you're pretending to be a Viking, but you can see other Viking ships in the distance, which just makes it like extra real. But one of the things that I don't know if enough people are aware that this is an experience people could do, and it's just so cool. I went in 2012, and I need to go back and like just do it for like a week or something, just show up every day. The town of Roskilde was actually kind of an important city, and so I'm excited to talk to you about the history of it. But I just want to people to understand before we dive in, like why it's such a cool place to know about. And if you can ever figure out how to get there, you should definitely go. So let's talk a little bit about Roskilde. Like, why are there Vikings there?
Yeah, so Roskilde was a town founded by Harold Bluetooth, King Harold Bluetooth. He was the notable man who brought Christianity to Denmark, as I mentioned earlier. And he was, in fact, the second king of Denmark. And it is interesting to note that he made Roskilde the capital city of Denmark in the year 960. And at this time, it's towards the end of the Viking Age. Denmark is really starting to become a nation, you know, during the reign of Harold Bluetooth, who owned and founded Roskilde. You know, the two parts of Denmark, you know, of course, there's the sort of island called Zealand, I believe it is, and then there's the peninsula of Jutland. He controlled both of those. So he basically had all of Denmark under his control, which was a big deal because most of the modern day nations that are united today were, you know, many small different kingdoms. But in Roskilde, he built a small wooden church that he consecrated to the Holy Trinity, as well as a royal residence nearby. Now, of course, that that church, the wooden one, doesn't exist anymore, but it's kind of a big deal because, again, with the whole Christianity thing, and his royal residence there ensured that many Danish kings and queens after him would rule from the city. But I'm pretty sure that, of course, it was built slightly after the Viking Age. In place of the church that we don't know about, there is a cathedral. I don't know if you've been there, that has all of the tombs of the more modern Danish kings and queens. So
yeah, unfortunately, when I was there, it was before I knew about the UNESCO World Heritage Site list, or I would have gone. So I have seen it from a taxi, but I haven't been. And so that's part of what it's like. I know I need to go back to Denmark, and I need to go back to this town. And when I go back, oh no, I get to sail on a Viking ship again.
Yeah. But no, that's the primary big thing about Roskilde, is that it was the capital city of Denmark for such a long period of time. And that's where many Danish royalty are buried, and many Danish royalty ruled there. So
I think that's important, because I think when I went, I was like really excited to know about like to sail on the ships, but I didn't know enough about like why the town was important to Viking culture, because I think we just from a North American perspective, you know, the history of Iceland and the history of Greenland is so much more interesting than thinking about like farmers who become traders and raiders. And, this was before the show was out, and it's just, I think people right now maybe don't remember what 6, 7, 8 years ago people really knew about the Vikings. It was just, Vikings are so popular right now. And I didn't know enough about him, but I knew enough to know I wanted to do it. But I didn't know why that town was important, that it actually was the capital of Viking Denmark for a period. So now, as far as the research that's going on today, so for me, it's super cool to float and to sail in a Viking ship, but these ships actually like play an important research role. And how do scientists and historians learn from recreating ships and actually sailing them, or recreating houses? You know, how does that contribute to what we know about Viking culture?
Yeah. So I think number one, for anyone who has the opportunity to sail upon a Viking ship or even go inside of a Viking home, like you really get to see and like be a part of history. You know what I mean? Like you really get to understand what it was like, you know, living like the Vikings. Like, unfortunately, I've not been able to go to any Viking related sites yet, although I will hopefully around this time next year. But, you know, whenever I would go to like Civil War related houses and sort of, you know, because I live in America, of course, and the mansions of the Gilded Age, I really got a sense of like, wow, like 3 former presidents stood in this very room that I'm standing in. So I think it's really important to portray history as something that's very much alive for people. Now, as far as the research there, you mentioned earlier that there were 5 Viking ships discovered in the fjord in Roskilde. And we know that around the year 1070, those 5 ships were deliberately sunk by the Vikings themselves in order to block some sort of enemy attack from the sea. And these ships were, of course, later excavated. That's why we have them. And it is interesting to note that they turned out to be 5 different kinds of ships, not just, you know, warships. There was cargo ships, ships of war. They were all different kinds of Viking ships. But as far as the research, yeah, I would think that it doesn't sound super technical, but just the idea of seeing history, you know, and really experiencing it for yourself is just the best way for anyone to connect with the past.
Now, for you, since you haven't been to any Viking sites yet and you are planning on going, what are some that you're looking forward to seeing?
Yeah, I've always been very keen on England. I've always dreamed of going there, and I've always been very keen on the northern bits in Northumbria and York, the city of Jorvik, which I talked about earlier. As far as other Viking sites, I would say, you know, there's just so many places. I know there's like some old Viking temples where actually pagans, people who still pray to Thor and Odin, worship. And as strange as that sounds, these like giant wooden temples were built hundreds of years ago. So I think it'd be so cool to go to some of those. I think that'd be awesome. I'd love to be able to sail on a Viking ship, possibly in Roskilde. I think they have one of those in, where's the other one? I'm trying to think.
So they have one in Norway, but I don't know if you can sail there. But the one in Roskilde, they send ships back and forth to England a lot and actually do. So I don't know if there's a place in England that's got a similar setup. But yeah. I know that they will do like long haul things. I don't know, more for science than for tourism. But I know they go back and forth to England sometimes.
Yeah, no, but when I do get sort of my trip all squared away, I'll have to definitely let you know, and you can perhaps point me in the right direction. Just give me some tips. But no, that would be fun if we got yourself, myself, and Lee Accomando out there. I think that would be a lot of fun.
That would be totally cool. And I'm based in Bulgaria, so a flight to Iceland or England are pretty cheap. Once you get there, they're not cheap, but the flight is not expensive. One of the fun things for me, so it's funny because so you, Lee, Patrick Wyman from Tides of History, Robin, who does the History of Byzantium podcast. It's funny, you guys all have these shows where you're getting really deep into the books and explaining to people the scholarship and the stories, the narratives behind these things. But because of that, it's not like you're in the physical location, you're doing it from far away. Or like Robin is going to Istanbul. I think he's going next month, or he's going at the end of this month. And so but for me, because I interview people, I don't do the scholarship part of it. I go to a place, I learn about the history, and then I interview someone. It's such a different way to approach learning about the history. And it's for me, I really like that I get to see places, but the flip side is a lot of times I learn after I've been somewhere some of the cool things about it because I do the interview later, or I keep studying it later, or it inspires me to go listen to a podcast. So I don't know if I get out as much as seeing it because I don't usually have all the background, but it inspires me to maybe look at a new alley of history that maybe I hadn't been interested in before. Whereas you guys, it's like you study. And then when you get to go somewhere, it's like, wow, like, cause every single little thing about it before you get to see it. So I think it's just, they're just two entirely different ways of looking at the combination of history and location and travel, but they're both really fun and interesting. And I think the best part is just both inspire people to get out into the world. And it just is like, what order do you want to experience the world in?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that is an interesting concept. Yeah, no, you certainly spend so much time. I certainly spend so much time, reading and, writing and researching for my show, but yet haven't actually been to the places. But, I watch a lot of documentaries. I play historically researched, video games. I'm a big historical gamer, and those are all ways to connect with the places where it happened. So I just think, I'm geeking out here, but it's so thrilling to be able to see history, really see history as being something tangible.
Yeah, exactly. And so for me, it's like, I'm a history fan of like 85,000 cultures. So I have a hard time only focusing on one. I like bouncing around between cultures. And so for me, like my style works a little bit better for me personally, because I like thinking about Malaysian history one day, Vikings the next, and then moving on to like Tunisian history. Like that's, but what I lack is getting super deep in one topic and really getting, like all of the connections and all of the synapses in my brain firing like about one topic. And that's why I love talking to you guys about places that, because you guys know the history of those places so much. Even if you haven't physically touched it, you could probably close your eyes and you could tell me all about, you know what I mean? Like it's just it's like looking at it from opposite ends of I don't know where I was taking that analogy, but it's just looking at it at two different directions, which I really appreciate. And when I started the show, I knew I could never be someone who focused that deep in one topic, but I knew I could find a lot of really smart people, bring them on, but hopefully talk about enough different kinds of places that people would maybe think about different trips they want to take, or maybe get a taste of it here and then go deeper. So like, I highly recommend if somebody's interested in Viking history to check out your show, check out the other 2 episodes we have of Viking history, and check out your show, and then keep going, get into Michael Drout's History of Vikings, or, something like that. So.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's great. And I would have to agree with you. Like, as much as I just have this passion for Vikings, I too, believe it or not, actually love other areas of history as well, like the Napoleonic era and sort of the Victorian age is probably, I would say, my second most favorite time in history.
Oh, so, cool.
Yeah.
I have a weird relationship with Napoleon. I don't know if I'll really love him until I go to the islands. Like, yeah. I feel like I saw a great Napoleon exhibit in Montreal a couple years ago. Not a couple years ago, like 5 years ago. Time is going by too fast. And I didn't connect with him in France very much. When I was in France, was way more connected with like French Revolution, Versailles. Like, and I have a hard time connecting with him. And I just, even when I read about him, it's hard. I think I'm going to need to like see where he lived his last years before I really start to appreciate what his life was like.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting because I certainly do have a hard time connecting with like other historical figures as well. I'm trying to think of an example, but no, I totally get that. Like, it's just like, they're kind of hard to relate to, I guess you could say, you know what I mean? Because they're so different or quirky or something. I don't know.
Well, it's such a, I don't know if it's postmodern, but it's such a 2018, like this time period to be like, I need to relate to these people. But I do, like, if I'm going to, like, I need the psychology behind famous people. Like, I was talking about that with Drew, who was on to talk about Angkor. It's like, Angkor is wonderful. I wish we had the stories of the kings that built it better. I want to know the fights they got in with their wives, and, you know, they're like all the weird stuff that we just don't know, because it feels, when you're there, it feels very empowering and surprising and majestic, but it feels a little cold, because which it's not the case when you're in somewhere like Europe where we know all of the stories. So, but yeah, I do like to know the psychology behind people, which is why the Vikings are both really interesting and really difficult, because you have to look at the sagas. That's mostly what we have. And people don't know how much of the sagas to take as like history and how much to take as literature. But I think that the History Channel has done a huge service. The creator of the Michael Hirsch, did a really great interview, and I'm blanking on the podcast that he did it on, where he explained like how he decided to do that show. And people were just like, why would anybody ever watch that? And he was just like, oh, no, they'll watch it. And it's like, of course, 6 years later, like, history fans are obsessed with it. But it's because he takes like a culture that everyone's interested in and introduces you to the characters in that culture that maybe we didn't get introduced before. Now, I actually did know who some of the characters were beforehand, because I listened to a really great modern scholar lecture series. I think it's Michael Drout's, but it might be someone else's. But most people don't know who Ragnar Lothbrok is pre that show. But once you know who he is, it's so much easier to understand Viking culture, because you have some really good personalities to attach it to.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. No, I would totally agree. And, you know, the Vikings, it's interesting, have always been sort of these mysterious characters, you know, these people emerging from the dark mystic fjords in Scandinavia. And, you know, but that's one thing that was so attractive to it about me. You know, I had read some Viking novels, and I would just, like, when somebody would say the word Viking, I would picture it was nighttime on a Viking settlement in Norway. And, you know, it was built right on the edge of a fjord, and you could hear the waves crashing along the rocks, and you could see all the stars and the northern lights, the auroras and the night sky. And so that's one thing that was super interesting to me. And there's certainly been this element of a mysticism to the Vikings for sure.
You know what's funny when you mentioned auroras? It's like, I don't know if I'll really, like, I feel like I've connected with their story a lot. I've been to a lot of places where there's Viking history, but I think I do need to see the aurora to understand a little bit more about it. And that's just something that, you know, you go to a castle, you go to a museum, you can plan around it. You know, it's going to be there. You can look the hours up ahead of time. And the aurora is just something you can't plan. You know, like, right. You can try, but you can't plan it. And so when I was in Iceland, we missed it. Like, if we had been in a town, like if we'd been in the town we were at during the day, that night we would have seen it, but we kept missing it. And I have to go back. Not necessarily there, but I have to go somewhere in Scandinavia and see it and photograph it. Like, and that is one of the things about like historic travel that, yes, it's a natural phenomenon, but like, as history fans, we connect to it from a historical perspective, and you can't circle it in on your calendar and say, that's the day I'm going to see it.
Yeah, no. And it's funny you mentioned the auroras, because actually it's believed, if you do some research on the history of the northern lights and the auroras, the Vikings actually, fantasized the auroras as well. So in Norse mythology, there is these characters, I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're known as Valkyries. Mm-hmm. And Valkyries are these glorious female shield maiden, you know, Viking warriors. And when someone would die in battle, they were the ones responsible for taking them to the place of the slain, which was Valhalla. And Valhalla is a place where those who died glorious deaths in battle would go. They would be taken by the Valkyries up to the hall where Odin, of course, lived, because it was his hall. And there they would train the slain warriors up for the twilight of the gods, the sort of the end of everything, which was Ragnarok. But it's interesting because the Auroras, some Vikings believed that they were actually the reflections of the swords and shields and armor of the Valkyries. So that's an interesting little tidbit there.
Oh, I like that. I like that a lot. All right, Noah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And where can people find you?
You can find me at my podcast, The History of Vikings. You can find that wherever you listen to your podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play. Or you can find me at my website, which is thehistoryofvikings.com. Or you can find me at Twitter at History of Viking.
Excellent. Well, listeners, I encourage you to go find his show, go deep into Viking history, and then when the second half of season 6 of Vikings comes back on, or is season 5, whatever is the season we're on right now, whenever the second half of it comes back, I would love if you guys would send me your comments about the show, because I'm obsessed with it. But no spoilers, because sometimes I'm a week behind. All right, Noah, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.